In our day, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Harris, the director here at the FDR Library, and that was just a portion of President Roosevelt's 1944 address where he introduced the Economic Bill of Rights, and it's the 80th anniversary of that. And we have here with us to speak about it today, Harvey Kaye. Welcome, Harvey.
Always great to see you, Bill, and always great to feel like I'm at the library.
Well, I wish you could be here. It's a beautiful day. Harvey is an old friend of the library's. He's Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice Studies, the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He's also written extensively about FDR and the fight for the four freedoms, which is a very good book I highly recommend, and FDR and democracy. So welcome, Harvey. We're going to talk about the Economic Bill of Rights today. And let's just step back for a second. We see the clip there, the newsreel footage from 1944, the day he gave the address. Where did this Bill of Rights that you heard him reading, this Economic Bill of Rights, how did that come to be? Where did that emerge from?
Well, for a start, let's understand that early on, even in the 1920s, FDR was becoming educated to the imperative of economic security. Even that is during the so-called Roaring Twenties. He was introduced to a whole host of women labor organizers in New York City by Eleanor, and they readily informed him of the insecurities of working class life. And this was clearly cooking in his mind. He also was already committed, should the opportunity present itself, and it did, both as governor of New York and later as president, to challenge the Gilded Age power structure of the late 19th century. But the first evidence that he's going to be thinking in terms of what will eventually be the idea of an economic Bill of Rights is evident in the campaign of 1932, his first run for the presidency. And after having launched the campaign early in 32, having been nominated and delivering a phenomenal acceptance speech in Chicago, that autumn, not long before the election, he gave a speech in San Francisco at the Commonwealth Club, a rather elite club, I presume. And in that speech, he talks about the imperative of reclaiming and renewing the original promise of the Declaration of Independence. That is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as rights. And he goes on towards the end of the speech to propose the creation of a new declaration, a Declaration of Economic Rights, especially a Declaration of Economic Rights that will guarantee and secure opportunities and needs for the forgotten man. Okay. So from the very beginning, there's evidence of this. he is going to be thinking in terms of addressing the need, especially now in the midst of the Great Depression, for economic security for working people. Not just economic security as in survival, but economic security that will afford opportunity, okay, that will actually enhance both the lives of working people and also the life of the nation. And what makes that so interesting is that in some ways it's not unlike Lincoln back in the 1860s. Lincoln always said that none of his political thoughts and sentiments, all of his political thoughts and sentiments could be traced back to the Declaration of Independence. And what we find as in the course of the 12 years of his presidency, that when FDR is going to advance that idea of rights, of economic security, he too is going to ground it in the founders' experience. And the first time, as I said, he did it with the Declaration of Independence. Eventually, as in 1944, he will do it by way of the Bill of Rights. Now, going through his speeches in the 1930s, you can really see the progression of this idea. For example, when he was presenting the New Deal, he talks about, with reference to the founders, he talks about rights. In 1934, he sends a message to Congress, and he says, listen to this. If, as our Constitution tells us, the federal government was established, among other things, to, in quotes, promote the general welfare, it is our plain duty to provide for that security upon which welfare depends. And he says, these three great objectives, the security of the home, the security of livelihood, and the security of social insurance, are, it seems to me, a minimum of the promise we can offer to the American people. They constitute a right which belongs to every individual and every family willing to work. They are the essential fulfillment of measures already taken toward relief, recovery, and reconstruction. In other words, once again, he grounds his vision in the founding moments, the founding and the framing Declaration and the Constitution. And he offers them as, if you like, a 20th century rendition of those fundamental rights going back to the revolution and the establishment of the United States as a nation. So the origins of it are rooted in his own experience back in the 1920s and even before that. But in the 1930s, facing the challenge of the Great Depression, he goes back to the founders to empower himself to offer these kinds of arguments. And the other thing about this is that he knew that no matter how much control he had over Congress, there were going to be those who would avidly oppose what he was going to request of Congress and project for the United States. And it did. The corporate bosses of the day organized the American Liberty League and tried to challenge him in terms of the founders. They offered their own sense of what the Declaration and the Constitution were about. But he literally was educating his fellow citizens to understand that what they felt they needed and what they might well be aspiring to was something that they were empowered themselves to aspire to by way of the words of Jefferson and the words of Madison and others.
So it's interesting that you say that, and I want to build on that, in that, so you've got a politician at work, and you've got some political rhetoric, but like all good politicians, and I'm not talking about whether you agree with them or not, but whether they're good politicians in terms of communicating their message, he's making that message palatable and more difficult to challenge, but also addressing it in the language of our founding documents.
Yeah,
he knew
absolutely
what he was doing there.
Absolutely.
So then, as we get from the mid-30s towards the late 30s and early 40s, where war is erupted in Europe, and the very notion of security is both physical security now, but what also ensures our physical security, does that begin to play into what this notion of economic security in the Bill of Rights is too?
Yes, and it's interesting, the speech where my scholarship had focused back when I was writing the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, the Four Freedoms speech, the State of the Union
I'm
message.
thinking of that, obviously, yeah.
Right, the State of the Union message of January 6th, 1941, which I did my best to promote on Twitter just less than 2 weeks ago. That speech is a warning to Americans. He's basically, in a way, it's a call to arms. He's saying, look, we're not going to be forewarned when the Nazis, I think his expectation actually was the Nazis would attack first, although he was well aware of what was going on in the Pacific. He said, we're not going to be warned when the attack comes. And indeed, he was right about that. But he said, we need to prepare for it. And he offered two ways to prepare. The first one was to turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy in order to assure that Britain and its allies, who are already facing Hitler and Nazi Germany, that they will have the wherewithal to withstand the blitzkrieg and the attack that they often presumed was going to involve the invasion of Britain. But the other thing was, he reassured Americans that if we turn ourselves into the arsenal of democracy, if we dedicate our industrial energies to defense and to the affording of a better defense for Britain, that this would not cost them what they had achieved during the 1930s. In fact, he said, and this was great, he said, we have all the more reason now to pursue the aspirations of the New Deal, because we cannot fight by armaments alone. We have to have a people capable of fighting. We have to strengthen the nation in diverse ways. And in fact, for what that's worth, I have to add that that was the vision that Eleanor Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia brought to the original civil defense initiatives back in 1940 into 1941. But then FDR goes on to say, he actually outlines the steps that need to be taken. And it sounds like he's sort of saying, I fully appreciate what the New Deal has entailed, and we are not going to stop doing it, though he probably knew that would be an expensive effort to do defense and New Deal at the same time. And he goes on, of course, to say, and you can almost hear the founders and even the Gettysburg Address in that speech, as far as I'm concerned. He says, okay, or he projects a vision of a post-war world that the United States will have contributed to creating and will pursue at war's end. And that those are the four freedoms. And the freedom of speech and expression is first, freedom of worship or freedom of religion is second. And then he offers these two additional freedoms, which really are viewed as a fairly radical kind of call: freedom from want and freedom from fear. The actual words he uses to define what those are not as radical as the sound of freedom from want and fear. But in fact, when Americans heard the speech, the overwhelming majority of Americans hearing that speech heard the first words, freedom from want and freedom from fear, and they believed that that was a promise of, we will not go back to the Depression. We will pursue freedom from want and freedom from fear. Now, during the war, he would say, my first task, he called it, I'll be Dr. Win the War. Okay, no more Dr. New Deal. But it was within 2 weeks after he made those remarks, he was already planning basically a redemption of the New Deal vision and the New Deal project. He had in mind a GI Bill of Rights. That the term hadn't come up yet, the GI Bill of Rights. And the original GI Bill of Rights, as he saw it, would also include benefits to those who had who had traveled to work in the defense industries on the coast of California, up to Washington, and also on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. That is, war workers, not only veterans of the military, would be able to secure those benefits. That he had to give up as a hope. Congress wouldn't go that far. But it's the case that in 1943, actually, let me begin. He had created during the New Deal, and all the more gave him a task, the National Resources Production Board, the NRPB, right? And by 1941, there was already the idea, based on other speeches he had given, that this committee, that this board was going to create an economic Bill of Rights. They didn't talk about it too publicly, but there were those who did. For example, the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, at the New York World's Fair with vast numbers of people. And at the New York World's Fair, they had this fountain, this pool of water that had a fountain in it. And the four corners of that pool of water had statues to the four freedoms of the Bill of Rights: basically freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. And LaGuardia is standing there, and the president and Mrs. Roosevelt were there as well. And he said, and I believe we can look forward to a fifth freedom. And what he lays out as the fifth freedom is like a mini version of what will become the Economic Bill of Rights. Moreover, a member of the committee, Charles Merriam of the University of Chicago, I believe, a political scientist, he gave a speech two speeches during 41, maybe into 42 at Harvard and Chicago. And he talks about the fact that this Economic Bill of Rights is being put together. So people didn't think about it terribly much, but there was already this proof that FDR had, if you like, licensed the authoring of such a thing. And also there's one other thing. There's one other thing which is just great. And this goes back to 1938. This is how early, and the FDR must have been talking to his cabinet behind the scenes about it. Solicitor General Robert H. Jackson, who would go on to become a Supreme Court justice, in 1938 told the National Lawyers Guild this: "We too are founders. We too are makers of a nation. We too are called upon to write, to defend, and make live new bills of right." And then he said, the Economic Bill of Rights that we're crafting will encompass collective bargaining for labor, the ending of starvation wages in sweatshops, the right of the willing to work, the right to a living when work is not available, the right to some shelter from the cruelties of impoverished age. So it's, in other words, probably from the time FDR took office, and all the more as fascism is on the march, both in Europe and in East Asia, these New Dealers, if you like, with FDR's approval behind the scenes, they're already beginning to craft and envision what will eventually be that Economic Bill of Rights speech. So the reports that they produced, massive reports, by the way, I mean, huge reports, always opened up with a projection of an Economic Bill of Rights. They actually listed them. It wasn't exactly what FDR would later say, but it was damn close to it. And then, based on those reports, FDR said, okay, we'll release the reports. This was in 43, very, very early 43. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal lambasted the reports. But there were many others, including political activists, labor leaders, and others who welcomed the thought of it. Okay. And I.F. Stone, the journalist, I think he was with The Nation at the time, I believe, he actually said that FDR has laid down the conflict, the struggle of the post-war years by having released these reports. FDR thought, well, I want to find out what the American people think about this. So he commissioned surveys, polling by the Princeton University polling, the OPOR, I'm forgetting, the Office of Public Opinion Research. That's it.
We've got those materials here at the library.
Yeah, I photocopied them all when I was at the library doing this work. They're all sitting back there. And the results were astounding. I mean, absolutely astounding. So, for example, I got to read the numbers just for, well, somewhere they're around here. The point is that it was like 85% of Americans, somewhere between 80 and 90% of Americans wanted such things as aid for students, housing, healthcare. I mean, every one of the items that would show up in what will be the Economic Bill of Rights speech, Americans overwhelmingly supported. And let me make it clear. Usually it was about 75% of Republicans and 95% of Democrats. So the mid-80s figure is really the average of all Americans. It's not a select sample of just Democrats. It's not a loaded sample. And this pretty much encouraged FDR. And in that January 1944 speech on this very day, back then, 80 years ago, he went before the American people. The speech is a rather long one, the State of the Union message. He lays out the imperative that the war effort should continue to be pursued with all of the effort and energy that had gone into it so far. He didn't want people to think merely because we were winning battles, the war was soon going to end. Then he also he actually talked about some initiatives he would pursue regarding taxes and national service draft. And then he says, as we heard in the speech, that we have come to accept it, and he starts off with a reference to the founders. We have come to accept, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights. And he lays this out, and it's, to my mind, in fact, some people have told me, I used to call it the most visionary speech. Some people call it the most radical speech in American history, because here's a president laying out a vision, a project, which is so against the grain of the previous, 50 years of American political economy. And one thing that was not included in that clip, I believe that's the clip that Michael Moore had in his film Capitalism, A Love Story, is a paragraph that follows that clip. I'll just recite that if that's all right. FDR says, after he says, for unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world. He goes on to say, one of the great American industrialists of our day, a man who has rendered yeoman service to his country in this crisis, the war, recently emphasized the grave dangers of rightist reaction in this nation. Everyone should listen carefully what FDR goes on to say. All clear-thinking businessmen share his concern. Indeed, if such reactions should develop, if history were to repeat itself, and we were to return to the so-called normalcy of the 1920s, then it is certain that even though we shall have conquered our enemies on the battlefields abroad, we shall have yielded to the spirit of fascism here at home. That's a hell of a warning, right? That's a hell of a warning.
It's interesting as a rhetorical device too, though. It's making you've just put people who would disagree with you into quite a category as well in the middle of a war. I think what strikes me, and I think you just think of that word fascism, is that FDR at any given time was called a socialist, a communist, or a fascist.
Yeah.
And I think some of the criticisms of this economic Bill of Rights, which is fascinating in that it's covering education, health care, it's your right to work, that or ability to earn a living, that it is an all-inclusive notion of the economy, of one's ability to function in our nation, that without any one of those pieces, we risked leaving people out or behind in such a way that was unjust, just as one would hope that the original Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights, doesn't exclude, but ultimately would include and would represent everyone. So, I mean, that reaction at that time, I've looked at the reaction mail to the Four Freedoms, and what I find fascinating about that mail is how many people who were against the Four Freedoms speech weren't really addressing the Four Freedoms themselves, but the very, the politics of whether we should be engaged in this sort of international world. What I need to do is look at the response letters, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't do it from the general public to this speech. What was the sort of reaction? We know what the Four Freedoms, as you said, with Wanton, that the people, I mean, that was a kind of it could be perceived as quite a radical notion.
Oh,
what does that mean? What is that? And now he's furthered that. He's put some meat on the bones a little bit, and it includes this broad, every broad aspect that touches us as we live in any society. What was the reaction to this?
Well, before I tell you the positive reaction, let me just tell you, given the reaction.
Well, sometimes the negative reaction is far more interesting.
Well, given the reaction of the editors of the Wall Street Journal, who basically were outraged at the very prospect of an economic Bill of Rights back in 43, they offered a different response to the actual second Bill of Rights speech. They said, it's as if they started to think, my God, we have to live with this possibly. All they said essentially was, let's just hope he doesn't intend to do away with the first Bill of Rights. Now, I know that's not an endorsement, but that's a hell of a lot different than they didn't dump all over it, as the expression goes. At the same time, the response was enthusiastic amongst the majority of Americans, but especially, needless to say, amongst the very folks who back in 42 and 43 had hoped for that kind of statement. So the labor union federations, then there were two federations, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Both labor federations immediately launched campaigns, not only for FDR's re-election in 44, but also enthusiastically for the enactment of legislation that would make real the vision of the Economic Bill of Rights. In fact, the CIO, I mean, they both invested in this, but the CIO organized the CIO PAC, Political Action Committee, with the specific project of advancing the Economic Bill of Rights. They created really beautiful pamphlets. I mean, they're black and white pamphlets, but they're beautiful in the rhetoric. And they really are arguing that the Economic Bill of Rights is a vision for all Americans, not for some Americans, but for all Americans. In fact, as long as we're on video, an entire volume of their pamphlets was later published in 45, I guess it was. Whoops. The first round, the story of the CIO Political Action Committee. And all these texts in here are pamphlets. And I tried to collect them all. Then I realized there was a book, so I could pick that up. As well, the National Farmers Union embraced it and launched a campaign in support of it. And at the same time, the National Citizens Political Action Committee was created, which was a national organization with a lot of liberal and progressive celebrities who turned out on behalf of this. So there was a lot of energy put into it. I don't know if anyone actually believed there would be 10 new amendments to the Constitution, but the idea was that FDR had challenged Congress, commissioned Congress, to start acting in those terms. And in fact, the Democrats, especially by the way, vast numbers of people turned out at rallies for healthcare and other things. Senator Wagner of New York held an event in New York City. I think it was in Central Park. It was called, they used to have what they called I Am an American Day, which was a celebration of the immigrant generations. And this one in particular was basically dedicated to the idea of an Economic Bill of Rights. And my own reading is that possibly 1 million people turned out for this event. And I didn't count them myself. I took the word of reports. So there was this kind of enthusiasm generated. And it's not surprising given the kinds of results that the pollsters got. Congress did pursue one. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No. I'm just curious, considering that, the battles political that ensued over and continue to this day regarding healthcare and regarding other aspects, specifically, address education. With this level of popularity for these ideas, what is the reason, or a reason, I know there are many, then that did not translate into more immediate results in terms of legislation in support of them?
Yeah, well, in 1938, there had emerged in Congress what was called the Conservative Coalition. And it wasn't the kind of thing where, these people always voted together on things, but Republicans and Southern Democrats had a sort of what used to be called the gentleman's agreement or gentleman's understanding. There were things that they were going to oppose because neither the Republicans nor the Southern Democrats, though for somewhat different reasons, wanted anything that smacked of socialism or social democracy as far as they were concerned. The Republicans, because they remained the party of Main Street and Wall Street pretty much at that time. And the Southern Democrats were essentially racist and white supremacists, and they made it clear that they had no intention of integrating hospitals and other kinds of public services. And a Bill of Rights would have dictated the integration or the desegregation of these kinds of facilities. And that's the grounds upon which, despite the popularity and despite the fact that Truman tried to make something of it, and the Democrats continued to put it into their platform, in fact, even had it in their platform in 1960, they knew that that race was going to not just inhibit, it was going to obstruct the pursuit. However, there was legislation introduced. It was the Wagner-Murray-Dingle Bill for national health care. Okay. After the war, Truman tried to secure a national health care plan. Similarly,
there was also Bill Burton for hospitals in communities around the country, and
right.
There were physical efforts, yeah.
And then also there was a full employment bill that was making to guarantee work for anyone who sought to secure employment. Unfortunately, once again, there was this coalition that watered down the bill. And by the way, so it passed as a full employment bill, but it did not include a guarantee of work for anyone who sought to pursue employment. In 1946, it's not quite chaos, but in the chaos of the post-war moments, okay, the Republicans won control of Congress. And that meant that much of what had happened in the New Deal was in jeopardy, but also, of course, the possibility of going further with an economic Bill of Rights was completely out of the question. However, of course, in 1948, Truman, who had tried to pursue certain initiatives, ran once again on that kind of platform. He won, but it was not the case that he was ever going to be able to secure those changes. Again, Southern Democrats and Republicans were blocking it at the time. And in 52, when Stevenson ran, it was not as strongly a Democratic Party platform piece.
Just as an aside, I find it fascinating, regardless of whether good people can agree or disagree on how one crafts policy to address one thing or another. It's fascinating always, and it's so unfortunate and alarming to me how issues of race and class can be used as wedges against people's own best interests by people on either side of the spectrum. It's telling that those battles are still being fought today. And
well, you should appreciate, one thing Americans often don't appreciate is that the laws that inhibited poll taxes and literacy requirements that inhibited blacks and obstructed blacks from voting in the South also inhibited poor whites from voting, which meant that in fact, I mean, it's quite possible the elites in the southern states just didn't want poor whites entering into certain kind of facilities either.
Certainly, as a native of Alabama, I certainly can appreciate some of that approach to how the system could work. Now, he gives the speech. Obviously, the focus is on still winning the war. You're right, FDR never pulled punches in that it was still going to be, the war was never won until it was won. But were efforts taken politically to move forward in the immediate aftermath of the speech? In terms of setting a legislative agenda, or what?
Well, the Democratic Party platform. The party platform that year was definitely an expression of Roosevelt's aspirations and the overwhelming majority of Americans' aspirations. As I said, there were initiatives by Senator Wagner, who had always been one of the truly leading figures in getting the New Deal initiatives through the Senate and Congress. Others had joined in that. After the war, one of the first times that Truman sent any kind of message to Congress, he actually sent a copy of the Economic Bill of Rights and the plan for an Economic Bill of Rights. He actually, I mean, most people doubted Truman's capacity because he had never really he hadn't been the vice president very long. But it was the case that in the spirit of FDR, he tried to pursue those things. And again, during that abbreviated first term of his, because he inherited the White House, he sought to pursue national health care. He also actually, to surprise of many people, he actually did launch a civil rights commission that issued a report that really became, actually, I know it sounds odd to think this white president from Missouri had done this, but in fact, it became kind of a blueprint for later civil rights initiatives. So there were those kinds of things.
And
one last thing. I just want to say the week after he went back to argue for the Economic Bill of Rights in that autumn political campaign, FDR also called for voting rights for all. A lot of people don't realize that. So it would have been October 1944. He made it clear, voting rights for all. The time had come.
It's interesting to note of what President Truman tried to do in terms of pulling it forward. And you mentioned the Civil Rights Commission, because other organizations and groups took this idea of an economic Bill of Rights and applied it and adjusted it or added different aspects to broaden the cause, perhaps. So what is the legacy of that notion of this, and how it has either been used for or against, frankly, or to craft a different view of what an economic Bill of Rights might look like?
Well, if we go back to the 60s and the Johnson administration, and Johnson for all of its faults and failings, really did think of himself as Roosevelt's adopted political son, because during the New Deal and the war years, he had actually headed up the National Youth Administration in Texas. He had served in Congress. Anyhow, so when he's president, his vision of a great society is clearly informed by the Economic Bill of Rights and the Four Freedoms. The other thing is that at the time, A. Philip Randolph, who had been one of the foremost labor and civil rights figures of the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he and Baird Rustin, put together a freedom budget, which they're hoping will be adopted in the mid-60s. And it is grounded in the call for freedom from want, and also the Economic Bill of Rights. And it was a magnificent project that he proposed, and it got endorsements from 150 leading labor, academic, political, foundation heads. And I have to say that, as fantastical as it may seem, because it was a plan to truly eliminate poverty, not just pursue a war on poverty, if we had not perhaps if we had not gone into the war in Vietnam, which soaked up a hell of a lot of resources, that freedom budget might have been pursued. And one of the reasons I say that is in 1965, 66, when the freedom budget comes out, the White House has decided to host an event at the White House to honor Randolph, which, it's going to be a big event, a weekend event at the White House. And it seemed like that would have been a great time to actually have LBJ, A. Philip Randolph, talk about, we're going to take the Great Society and War on Poverty initiatives even further. And let's not forget that among the things that did develop in the Great Society years were Medicare and Medicaid, which was a first step. And most of us who were living, I was a teenager at that time, believed that was the first step towards national health care, universal health care, as FDR had projected it. And those kinds of initiatives that came up in the Great Society clearly were a recognition that if you're going to create a more prosperous and energetic America, that you had to combat poverty, and you've got to build on the initiatives of the New Deal and on the vision, perhaps, of the Economic Bill of Rights. Similarly, in 1968, not long before his very tragic death, his assassination in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. called for an Economic Bill of Rights for all Americans. And I have to say that he would have been very much aware back in 1944 and 45 of FDR's aspirations. King's father was very much a Roosevelt fan of Roosevelt. And also, when he was at college as this precocious teenager back in the 40s, that's King, A. Philip Randolph was a guest at the college back at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And you can imagine FDR's speech and A. Philip Randolph's understanding of things, and this young Martin Luther King Jr., whose father had already predisposed him to such kinds of political ambitions and aspirations. It comes back 30 years, from 45 to 65.
It does strike me that when you begin to discuss broadly as a right, access to education, to healthcare, beyond your ability to live and house yourself, appropriate housing, to be able to function within the economy. Suddenly, that terrifying Pandora's box of equality begins to just spill forth, doesn't it? And that's an alarming thing to me.
We did an interesting thing. A colleague and I. This goes back maybe a decade. A colleague and I, a much younger colleague than I am, and I were team teaching an introductory course in our department called Introduction to Democracy and Justice. And we always started with, I would give a talk about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the revolutionary pamphlet, and then we'd have them take up the Declaration of Independence. And my colleague, at one time, and I thought it was a brilliant idea, said to the students, if you were going to write up a new Declaration of Independence, what kinds of things would be necessary for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And they had no idea of the Economic Bill of Rights. And they basically came up with a list that my goodness, it was as if they had channeled FDR in 1944.
Well, it makes one wonder. And if we don't have any questions, then I'll unfortunately bring us to a close. But it does make one wonder whether whether there is a universality to notions that if one isn't can't feed oneself or have access to health care or can't improve oneself in an equal fashion, that it just begs the question about whether there's a universality there amongst all of us to that regard. Not being political in any way with that, just as a statement of we're founded on notions of egalitarianism, then that spreads to all aspects of our society, it would seem. So, well, Harvey, no questions, because I think you've just wowed everyone so much with your discussion. See, I'm being a very generous host, but seriously, I think that these conversations are so important to see the intersection of both the politics of it, as well as the value set of it, as well as notions of what we would want to be as a people, but also the way it can be disrailed on questions of hate and inequality. With us today on an anniversary of something that's very important to the Roosevelt administration, certainly, and into our political and social life to this day.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. You and Cliff, who's behind the scenes here, know that I've been talking about this Economic Bill of Rights for some time, and this past year I urged Cliff not to forget. We have to acknowledge that memorial. We have to commemorate that day. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
No, it's important. It's an important aspect, as you've pointed out. It's central to certainly the domestic policy going back into the formative years of the 20s, and it's important that people appreciate that it precedes the White House years, that it is essential to the operation of their view of the world and the way it could be implemented. Of course, those are always political questions, but how you do something, but that the values underneath it, maybe that's not a political question. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.